My God, this incredible HFY masterpiece found you today. Witness the legend, starting now.
My name is Vrith Solon, and I am a senior xenobiologist aboard the Galactic Consortium research vessel Undying Curiosity. I have spent 43 years of my life studying species across 9 star systems. I have cataloged apex predators, documented extinction events, and once sat 2 meters away from a Crovian rockstalker without flinching, which is something my colleagues still refuse to believe. I say all of this not to impress you. I say it so that when I tell you what happened during the Human Death World Study Phase 7, you will understand that I am not a being who scares easily. And yet, Phase 7 scared me. Not because of the predator. No. The predator was the least terrifying thing in that entire operation. It was the humans. It is always the humans. Let me give you some context, because context matters. Especially when the Consortium Review Board later tried to pretend this entire experiment had gone largely as planned. Spoiler, it had not. Not even slightly. Not even in the most generous, squinting, creative reinterpretation of the word planned. The experiment began as a simple behavioral stress test. The question on the table, as proposed by lead researcher Davin Priel and co-signed by 4 other scientists who should have known better, was this: how do humans respond to the introduction of a known apex predator in a controlled semi-natural environment? Simple, elegant, completely reasonable. On paper, the apex predator in question was a juvenile Thovrak, specifically a cub of approximately 14 months in biological age. For those of you unfamiliar with Thovrak anatomy, I will describe it briefly. A Thovrak is a 6-limbed carnivore native to the moon Grevash IV. At full maturity, it stands nearly 3 meters at the shoulder, weighs roughly 800 kilograms, and possesses retractable keratin blades along its forearms that can shear through grade 4 hull plating. Its hide is layered in dense overlapping scale-like dermal plates. Its jaw pressure is strong enough to crush bone, metal, and the professional confidence of anyone who ever said "I've seen worse." At 14 months, the cub we selected, whom the research team internally designated as Subject Thovrak 1, weighed a modest 160 kilograms, still capable of severe bodily harm, still possessing those forearm blades, though they were not yet fully calcified, still loud enough when it vocalized to make 3 of my junior staff members drop their data tablets in pure reflexive terror. We called the cub Fenrath. Not officially, of course. Officially it was Subject Thovrak 1. But Devan started calling it Fenrath on day 2 of the pre-deployment observation period because, and I quote, "it has the energy of a Fenrath storm. Wild, unpredictable, and exhausting." The name stuck. Names always stick when Devan gives them. It is one of his more dangerous qualities. The human subjects were selected with equal care. 3 individuals, volunteers from the Terran Integration Program, all of whom had signed consent forms acknowledging they were participating in a non-hostile xenobiology interaction study, which was technically accurate. We had not told them a Thovrak cub would be involved. We had described it as a large, unfamiliar animal. Legal had reviewed the forms. Legal had approved the forms. Legal, I suspect, had not actually read the forms. The first human was a woman named Petra Voss, age 31, occupation listed as wilderness guide and survivalist instructor. She had spent 6 years leading expeditions through the Patagonian ranges of her planet's southern continent, and had, on one occasion, fended off a fully grown Terran bear with nothing but a walking stick and, reportedly, a lot of shouting. I read her file 3 times. I still was not sure if she was brave or simply had no functioning self-preservation instinct. The second human was a man named Rudo Bakari, age 26. He was a veterinary researcher who specialized in large animal behavior. His file noted that he had extensive hands-on experience with megafauna rehabilitation, which on Earth apparently means he had personally handled animals that could kill him, repeatedly as part of his job voluntarily. He had also apparently once convinced a panicking adult elephant to calm down by sitting on the ground near it and humming. I filed that detail away under humans are inexplicable and moved on. The third was a young woman named Suki Orlan, age 22. She was a student enrolled in an interspecies biology program. She had no survival training listed, no field experience, no documented history of reckless bravery. What she did have was a 3-page supplementary note from her academic supervisor, describing her as alarmingly fearless around large animals, to a degree that is either a gift or a serious problem, and possibly both. She had been selected according to Davin's notes because she was an outlier who will produce interesting data. I had looked at those 3 files and felt something I can only describe as preemptive concern. The kind of concern a person feels when they watch someone confidently pour an unidentified liquid into a reaction vessel without checking the label. But the experiment had been approved. The habitat had been prepared. Fenrath had been transported. And so, on the morning of what I will forever think of as the day the experiment left the building, we began Phase 7. The habitat was a large enclosed structure, roughly 300 meters by 200 meters, designed to replicate a temperate mixed forest environment. Real trees had been cultivated inside. A shallow stream ran through the eastern quadrant. There were rock formations, clearings, and 2 small ridgelines that gave the space actual elevation variation. It had taken 14 months to construct. It was, genuinely, beautiful work. We had seeded it with the smells and sounds of a natural ecosystem through a sophisticated sensory emitter array. The temperature was calibrated to within half a degree of Grevash-4's surface average. We had even replicated the exact soil composition of Fenrath's native territory, because Davin had read that Thvovrak cubs navigate partially by ground scent, and he wanted the cub to feel, and I cannot stress enough how much I hated this word choice at the time, at home. Fenrath had been introduced to the habitat 36 hours before the humans, to allow it time to settle, establish territorial markers, and in Davin's words, find its feet. What Fenrath had actually done during those 36 hours, according to the monitoring logs, was sprint back and forth across the entire habitat 17 times, uproot a small tree for no apparent reason, eat it partially, abandon it, splash through the stream repeatedly, and then spend 4 hours in the northeastern rock cluster making a sound that our acoustic analysts could only describe as low-level aggressive contentment, whatever that meant. When the humans entered the habitat on the morning of day 1, we watched from the observation gallery above. The gallery ran the entire length of one long wall, with one-way transparency panels and full sensor coverage. 12 researchers, myself included, were present. We had coffee. We had data tablets. We had emergency extraction protocols in place, because we were not entirely without sense. Petra entered first, moving with the calm, measured stride of someone who had spent years walking through environments where things could kill her. She scanned the tree line, clocked the stream, noted the rock formations, and then stood still for approximately 20 seconds just listening. Rudo came in behind her, and he did something interesting immediately. He crouched down, picked up a handful of soil, smelled it, and then rubbed it between his fingers with an expression of deep professional interest. He looked up at the tree canopy, then back at the ground. Suki walked in last and stopped, looked around at the whole habitat with wide eyes and said loudly enough for our audio pickups to catch clearly, "Oh, this is brilliant. Not this is dangerous. Not what am I walking into. Just brilliant." Up in the observation gallery, my colleague Thevra Ondas leaned toward me and whispered, "I already have a bad feeling about her." I told Thevra she was being dramatic. I was wrong. Fenrath found them within 40 minutes. Or more precisely, Fenrath smelled something new in its territory, decided this was unacceptable, and went to investigate with the focused energy of a creature that has not yet learned the concept of caution. The cub came out of the northeastern rock cluster at a fast trot, moving through the tree line with surprising quiet for something that weighed 160 kilograms. Our thermal imaging tracked it perfectly. It slowed as it got within about 50 meters of the human's position, picking up their scent trail. Then it stopped. Petra and Rudo had noticed. Petra had gone completely still. Rudo, remarkably, had slowly crouched down and was watching the tree line with the patient stillness of someone who had done this before, professionally. Suki had not noticed because Suki had found the stream and was currently crouching over it, looking at something in the water with intense concentration, completely unaware that 160 kilograms of juvenile apex predator was standing in the trees 30 meters behind her. In the observation gallery, someone said, "Oh no," very quietly. I think it was me. Fenrath stepped out of the tree line. The cub was genuinely imposing, even at this age. Its dermal plates caught the habitat lighting and gave it a slate-gray armored appearance. Its 6 limbs moved in the fluid, overlapping gait pattern characteristic of Thvovrak locomotion, smooth and disturbingly quiet. Its head was low, scenting. Its forearm blades were slightly extended, which in Thvovrak body language indicated alert curiosity rather than aggression, but which also looked to any reasonable observer deeply alarming. Petra saw it first. She did not scream. She did not run. She turned her body side on, which reduced her silhouette, dropped her center of gravity slightly, and raised one hand in a slow open palm gesture that apparently was a standard Terran signal meaning stop. I am not a threat. Whether Fenrath understood Terran hand signals was obviously irrelevant, but the gesture was slow and deliberate enough that it did not trigger a pursuit response. Rudo had seen it too. He remained exactly as he was, crouched, still, watching. Fenrath took 3 more steps forward, stopped, and made the low vocalization our acoustic team had been cataloging all week. A deep rolling vibration somewhere between a growl and a purr, which was confusing enough that even our specialists could not fully agree on what it indicated. And then Suki stood up from the stream. She turned around, She came face to face with Fenrath at a distance of approximately 12 meters. There was a moment, it could not have been more than 2 seconds of absolute stillness, and then Suki said, in a voice that was genuinely calm, with a kind of awed delight that I can still hear clearly in my memory. "Oh, hello. You are enormous." Fenrath froze. The cub had been raised in a controlled environment with limited social contact, specifically to preserve its natural behavioral responses for the purposes of the experiment. It knew prey scent, it knew threat response patterns. It did not know what to do with a small, soft-bodied creature that had just looked directly at it with zero fear, and spoken to it with the warmth of someone greeting an old friend. Fenrath's head tilted, one full rotation to the left, like a creature whose internal database had just returned an error. Suki took one small step forward. Every single person in the observation gallery made a sound, a collective intake of breath that Tevra later described as the noise 12 scientists make when they realize simultaneously that they have made a catastrophic error in subject selection. Rudo said quietly without moving. "Suki, do not move." Suki said, "It is not displaying aggression. Look at the shoulder posture." Rudo said, "I know what the shoulder posture means. I need you to, Suki, please do not move." Suki said, "I just want to see its face better." Fenrath made the rolling vocalization again, louder this time. It took one step toward Suki. Suki crouched down slowly until she was at a lower eye level than the cub, and held out one hand, palm up, fingers loosely curled. The exact gesture Rudo told us later in the debrief that he used with large animals during rehabilitation work. The gesture that says, "I am making myself small. I am not competing with you. I am here." In the observation gallery, Davin grabbed my arm. Fenrath lowered its head. It sniffed Suki's outstretched hand. Then it made a sound that none of us had recorded before. A shorter, softer version of the rolling vocalization, quieter, almost tentative. Suki said, barely above a whisper, "There you are." And Fenrath sat down, not a defensive crouch, not a pre-attack compression of weight. It sat fully, in the way that large, heavy animals sit when they have decided, on some ancient instinctual level, that they are no longer in a situation that requires them to be ready to move. In the observation gallery, 12 xenobiologists stared at a screen in complete silence. Devon, after approximately 15 seconds, turned to the group and said, "This is unexpected." I told him that was the understatement of the century. He agreed. Over the next 3 hours of day 1, something happened that I can only describe accurately as a systematic destruction of our experimental framework. Fenrath did not behave like a territorial apex predator introducing itself to prey. Fenrath, after that first hesitant moment with Suki, began to follow the 3 humans around the habitat with the persistent, slightly pushy energy of a creature that had decided these odd-smelling, soft-bodied newcomers were interesting. Rudo, to his enormous credit, immediately shifted into what he called rehabilitation mode, which meant he stopped thinking about the experiment entirely and started thinking about the animal. He moved around Fenrath with practiced confidence, never making direct, sustained eye contact, never moving suddenly, narrating quietly to Petra and Suki exactly what the cub's body language was communicating. Shoulder drop, that means it is relaxed. Head tilt, curiosity. That sound is, I think, contentment, or something close to it. Petra, who had spent 6 years in environments full of animals that could kill her, adapted with a speed that was almost offensive. Within an hour, she was moving around Fenrath with comfortable awareness, the same way she moved through wilderness terrain, with respect and attention but without fear. And Suki. Suki had somehow, within those 3 hours, convinced Fenrath to let her touch the side of its jaw. I watched it happen on the monitoring feed. She had not rushed it. She had crouched near the cub for nearly 40 minutes, just being present, occasionally talking in a low, even voice, not trying to reach out, just existing near it, and Fenrath had gradually shifted closer and closer, drawn in by something I do not have a scientific term for, until it was close enough that when Suki slowly raised her hand and rested her fingers very gently against the side of its jaw, the cub simply let it happen. Fenrath turned its massive head slightly into the contact. Devra, beside me, said, "I genuinely do not know what I am looking at." I said, "I think we made a mistake releasing an apex predator into an enclosure with humans." Devra said, "You think it was a mistake because," I said, "because I think the humans are winning." By the end of day 1, our experiment had produced exactly 0 data on human stress responses to apex predators because the humans were not stressed. What we had instead was 47 pages of observational notes on an unprecedented cross-species social bonding event, 3 increasingly excited voicemails from Davin to the review board, and 1 juvenile Thavrak who had, by the evening monitoring window, draped approximately 40 kilograms of its front end across Rudo's legs, while Rudo sat calmly against a rock formation and scratched behind its dermal plate joints. "It likes that spot," Rudo said to no one in particular. Probably to us through the audio feed, probably knowing we were watching every second of this, right where the plate edges overlap. Probably gets itchy there. From the observation gallery, I watched 160 kilograms of apex predator close its primary eyes and produce the long, rolling vocalization that our acoustic team had been cataloging all week. That is definitely contentment, Thegra said. Write it down, I said. I am writing everything down, she said. I have been writing everything down since hour 1. I have not stopped writing. Good. We were going to need every word of it. Because day 2 had not even started yet, and I already knew with absolute certainty that whatever we thought this experiment was going to be, it was not going to be that. Not even close. I want to be clear about something before I continue. The Galactic Consortium research vessel Undying Curiosity has produced in its 31 years of operation some of the most significant xenobiological research in recorded history. We have cataloged 214 species. We have published landmark papers on predator cognition, death world ecology, and interspecies chemical communication. Our work is cited in textbooks across 40 star systems. None of that prepared us for day 2, not even slightly. Day 2 began at approximately 0600 habitat time, which was when our overnight monitoring team sent a message to the main research channel that simply read, "You all need to see the night footage. All of it, right now." I had been awake for 6 minutes. I had not yet had my morning nutrient supplement. I pulled up the footage anyway because when your overnight monitoring team sends a message with that level of urgency at 0600, you do not wait for breakfast. The footage showed the following sequence of events. At 0130, Fenrath had moved to the sleeping area where the 3 humans had set up their rest stations, simple cots with thermal blankets positioned near the central clearing. The cub had circled the perimeter of the clearing 3 times, scenting, and then settled itself approximately 4 meters from the nearest human, which was Rudo. This on its own was notable. Thavrak cubs in the wild do not voluntarily reduce distance to unknown species during rest periods. That behavior runs completely against documented territorial instinct. At 0230, Fenrath had shifted position, now 2 meters from Rudo. At 0340, 1 meter. At 0415, Fenrath was pressed against the side of Rudo's cot with its chin resting on the habitat floor and its primary eyes half closed, and Rudo, who had apparently woken up at some point during this gradual approach and made a conscious decision to simply allow it, was lying completely still with one arm draped over the edge of the cot, his fingers resting loosely on the top of Fenrath's head. At 0500, Suki had woken up, seen this scene, and rather than responding with any of the reasonable reactions available to her, had silently moved her own cot 3 meters closer to Fenrath and gone back to sleep. When I showed this footage to Davin at 062 day, he watched the whole thing without speaking. Then he rewound it, watched it again, set down his supplement cup, picked it up again, set it down. The cub sought proximity, he said finally. Yes, I said, during a rest period. Yes, with creatures it had known for less than 12 hours. Correct. Devan was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Vreth, I think we may have introduced a severely under-socialized apex predator to the only species in the known galaxy that it finds emotionally legible. I stared at him. He said, write that down. I wrote it down. The humans woke up at 0700. Petra first, then Rudo, then Suki. Their morning routines were individually fascinating pieces of data. Petra woke up, assessed her surroundings with the swift, comprehensive visual sweep of someone who had slept in dangerous places many times, registered Fenrath's presence 2 meters away, nodded once as though this was simply a fact to be filed and managed, and then began her morning physical conditioning routine in the clearing. Push exercises, balancing movements, controlled breathing sequences. She moved through it all with focused efficiency, completely unbothered by the juvenile apex predator watching her from 3 meters away with the tilted head curiosity of a creature encountering something it did not have a classification for. Fenrath watched her for about 20 minutes. Then, apparently deciding that what Petra was doing looked like a challenge of some kind, the cub stood up, stretched in the full Thovrak morning extension sequence that deployed all 6 limbs in a slow, powerful spread, and then began pacing along the clearing perimeter with the bouncing, slightly excessive energy of a young animal that had a lot of stored momentum and no clear plan for it. Petra, without pausing her routine, said, Yes, I see you. Very impressive. You have more legs than I do and you are still slouching. Fenrath made the short, curious vocalization. Petra said, Do not give me that. In the observation gallery I wrote, Human subject Petra Voss has begun verbally critiquing the posture of a Thovrak cub. Then I looked at what I had written. Then I left it there because it was accurate, and accuracy matters in science. Rudo spent his morning doing something that made my entire research team lean toward their monitoring screens simultaneously. He had produced from his personal kit bag a small handheld device he had apparently brought into the habitat without flagging it on his equipment manifest, which I would later have a significant administrative conversation with him about, and was using it to record detailed observational notes about Fenrath's anatomy and behavior from close range, not from a safe distance. Close range, as in, he had positioned himself approximately 2 meters from the cub, who was eating a protein supplement block we had left in the habitat, and was quietly narrating into his recorder while making small sketches on a datapad. Forearm blade calcification appears to be approximately 60% complete, consistent with 14-month developmental stage, Rudo said to his recorder. Dermal plate overlap pattern suggests recent growth surge. There is visible stretching at the posterior junction points, probably uncomfortable. He paused, looked at Fenrath, said conversationally to the cub, "Are those sore, the back plates?" Fenrath looked up from the protein block, chewed, looked at Rudo with the flat ancient patience of a predator that is currently eating and cannot be bothered to be offended. Rudo said, "I will take that as a yes. Later I want to look at those junctions properly, if you will let me." Fenrath went back to eating. Rudo made a note. The Vra next to me said in a very quiet voice, "He is negotiating examination consent with a Thovrak cub." I said, "He is." "Yes," she said, "and it is working." I said, "It appears so." She said, "Vreth, I want you to know that I studied xenobiology for 11 years, and nothing in my training covered this." I said, "Nothing in my training covered this either, and I have been doing this for 43 years. Suki's morning activity was the one that produced the most direct data catastrophe for our original experimental framework. She spent the first hour after waking up just being near Fenrath. That was genuinely the most accurate description I could put in my notes. She sat in the grass about 3 meters from the cub, with her legs crossed and her hands in her lap, and she was present in the deliberate, patient way that Rudo had described the previous day as the foundational behavior of large animal trust building. She was not performing it. She was simply doing it, naturally, as though it were obvious. Fenrath finished eating, stretched again, and then walked directly to Suki and sat down facing her at a distance of approximately 60 centimeters. At 60 centimeters, a 14-month Thovrak cub is close enough that you can feel the thermal output from its dermal plates. It is close enough that the size differential becomes very visceral. The cub's head, just its head, was larger than Suki's entire torso. Suki looked up at it and said, "Good morning." Fenrath made the low, rolling vocalization, the long one, the contentment one. Suki smiled. Then she said, "And I want to be precise about this because I read back the audio transcript 4 times and it did not change. I think you were lonely, before us. I think they kept you too isolated, and you did not know what to do with that." Fenrath's head dropped slightly. Suki reached up slowly and placed her hand on the cub's jaw again. The same spot as the day before. In the observation gallery, Davin said, "She is correct." Everyone looked at him. He said, "Thovrak cubs in the wild have extensive social contact with their maternal unit and sibling groups for the first 18 months of development. Fenrath was isolated for controlled study purposes from month 3. He paused. "We created an attachment-deficient predator and then released it to the only beings in this habitat who instinctively responded to it with warmth instead of fear." The observation gallery was very quiet. Davin said, "I am going to need to revise our ethics protocol significantly." I said, "That is the least of what you are going to need to revise." By midday of day 2, the experiment had entirely ceased to be an experiment, and had become something I was struggling to categorize. It was not a failure exactly. We were collecting extraordinary data. It was simply not the data we had planned to collect. What we were watching was a real-time first-contact social integration event between a juvenile apex predator and 3 humans, and it was progressing with a speed and smoothness that defied everything we understood about Thovrak developmental behavior. Petra had, somehow, turned her morning exercise routine into a shared activity. She had started doing her balance sequences near Fenrath, and the cub had begun mirroring some of the postures in that not-quite imitation way that young animals do when they are processing new movement patterns. When Petra did a slow, controlled single-leg stance, Fenrath would lift one of its 6 limbs and hold it extended, wobbling slightly, with what I can only describe as concentrated effort, and the expression of an animal that has committed to something and refuses to give up on it. "Good," Petra told it, completely seriously. "Engage the core. You have 6 of them, so you have no excuse." Fenrath wobbled, did not put the limb down. Petra said, "Better." Rudo had spent the afternoon in close proximity to Fenrath, and true to his morning intention, had conducted what was essentially a voluntary physical examination of the cub's posterior dermal plate junctions. Fenrath had tolerated this with varying levels of patience, occasionally turning its head to look at what Rudo was doing with the mild, resigned expression of a patient who has accepted that the examination is necessary, but would like it on record that they are not enjoying it. The tissue here is inflamed, Rudo told Petra, who had come over to observe. Growth-related. Not infected, just stretched. In large terrestrial animals, I would apply a topical anti-inflammatory. I do not know if Thovrak physiology would respond similarly. Petra looked at Fenrath. Does that hurt? Fenrath made a short, slightly sharper vocalization. Rudo said, I am going to take that as yes. He sat back. I can put in a request to the team watching us, whoever they are. And here he looked directly up at where he had clearly deduced one of our observation panels was located, which caused 3 researchers near me to physically step backward in unison. For an appropriate topical compound. If they are doing their jobs, they will understand what I am asking for and why. There was a pause in the observation gallery. Davin looked at me. I looked at Davin. Davin said, Get him the compound, I said. We are now providing veterinary support to our experimental predator at the request of our human subject. Devon said, Yes, I said. Our experimental framework is completely gone. Davin said, Yes, Vreth, it is. Get him the compound. We delivered the compound through the habitat supply hatch at 1400. Rudo collected it, read the label, nodded, and applied it to Fenrath's posterior plate junctions with a practiced efficiency that made it look like he had done this 100 times on 100 different species. Fenrath bore it with dignified stillness, and then, when Rudo finished, turned around and pressed the top of its head against Rudo's chest with enough force to knock him back 2 full steps. Rudo caught his balance, laughed, and put both hands on the sides of Fenrath's head. All right, he said. All right. You are welcome. From the observation gallery, Thevra said, Are we watching a human become friends with a Thovrak? I said, We are watching 3 humans become friends with a Thovrak. She said, For the record, I want to note that I told you on day 1 that I had a bad feeling about subject 3. I said, You did. She said, I was wrong about what kind of bad feeling it should have been. The afternoon of day 2 produced the single most commented upon piece of footage in the entire Phase 7 archive, and the archive is substantial. If you have read any of the consortium's published summaries of this study, you have probably encountered a reference to what became known internally as the river incident, though calling it an incident is generous. It was more of an event, a happening, a moment that several of my colleagues in their published responses to the Phase 7 report described using words like unprecedented and paradigm shifting, and in one case deeply funny, in a way that undermines the seriousness of the research. That last reviewer was not wrong. It began when Suki decided to go swimming. The habitat stream, in its eastern section, widened into a pool approximately 8 meters across and 1.5 meters at its deepest point. The water temperature was calibrated to a comfortable Terran range warmth. Suki had apparently noticed this pool on day 1 and had been thinking about it since, because on day 2 afternoon she walked to the eastern quadrant, removed her outer clothing layer with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who grew up around water, and walked into the pool. Fenrath followed her to the water's edge. The cub stopped at the bank, looked at the water, looked at Suki, who was now waist-deep and looking back at the cub with an expression of open invitation. Thovrak, for reference, are not water-averse. They swim competently when necessary. They do not, however, choose recreational water contact. There is no documented case of a Thovrak entering water for any purpose other than crossing or pursuit. Suki splashed water toward the bank with one hand. Fenrath flinched back, then looked at the water, then looked at Suki. Suki said, Come on. Fenrath made a sound that I can only describe, and I am aware this is not rigorous scientific language as deeply uncertain. Suki said, I am not going to make you, but it is very nice. Fenrath took one step toward the water, stopped, looked at the water with the focused, weighing attention of a creature running a very serious internal calculation. Then it walked into the pool. All 6 limbs, full body immersion up to the shoulder plates, right into the pool. The sound it made when the water hit its inflamed posterior plate junctions was a short, explosive vocalization that our acoustic team classified as surprise discomfort, but which Rudo, watching from the bank, immediately identified as the sharp intake equivalent of a creature going, Oh, that is cold, wait, no, that is actually good. Suki laughed, out loud, fully, with genuine delight. Fenrath turned its massive head toward the sound, and then the cub moved through the water toward her, not charging, not pursuing, but moving with the specific curious energy of a creature that has decided it wants to be where that sound is coming from. Suki held her ground as 160 kilograms of juvenile apex predator waded toward her and stopped approximately 1 meter away, water streaming off its dermal plates, primary and secondary eyes all focused on her with an expression of complete, bewildered fascination. She reached out and put her hand on its jaw. Fenrath made the long, rolling vocalization, the contentment one. In the observation gallery, nobody said anything for a very long time. It was Dovan who finally spoke, and what he said, I recorded it word for word because I knew immediately that it was going to end up in every paper we wrote about this study. The human did not civilize the predator. The predator was always capable of this. We just never gave it anyone worth being civil with. The formal experiment concluded at the end of day 3. The review board had initially approved a 5-day observation window, but by the end of day 2 it had become clear that continuing under the original experimental framework was no longer scientifically valid. We were not observing a stress response study anymore. We were observing something else entirely, and that something else deserved its own research design, its own ethics review, its own protocols. The debrief with the 3 humans was one of the more remarkable professional conversations I have had in 43 years of research. Petra, Rudo, and Suki sat across from Davin and me in the post-habitat assessment room, and they were, all 3 of them, completely calm. No elevated stress indicators, no signs of residual fear response, nothing. Davin asked them how they would describe their experience. Petra said, educational, for both parties. Rudo said, I would like access to the full physiological data you collected on the cub. The plate junction inflammation needs ongoing monitoring, and I have some ideas about dietary adjustments that might support the growth phase. Suki said, can we go back? I want to see how Fenrath is doing. I want to know if they, and here she paused and corrected herself with a firmness that suggested she had already made a decision about how she was going to refer to the cub going forward, if they are all right. Devon looked at me. I looked at Davin. He said, that is something we would need to discuss with the review board. Suki said, I am going to take that as a yes until told otherwise. She was not wrong to do so. The Consortium Review Board received our Phase 7 preliminary report 14 days later. The report was, as I had warned Davin it would be, somewhat difficult to present without extensive contextual framing. We had gone in to study how humans respond to apex predators. What we had documented instead was a 3-day sequence in which 3 humans had, through a combination of professional expertise, instinctive warmth, and what I can only call complete absence of appropriate terror, turned a developmentally isolated juvenile Thovrak into something that flinched when Suki left the habitat and pressed its head against the door panel for 40 minutes after she was gone. The board had questions. Many questions. The most repeated question, asked in various forms across a 2-hour review session, was essentially, how? How had the humans moved so fast? How had Fenrath responded so readily? How had 3 individuals with no specific Thovrak training produced in 72 hours a cross-species social bond that our own team of specialists had not considered a realistic outcome? Davin answered every version of this question the same way. He said, they were not afraid, and Fenrath had never encountered anything that was not afraid of it. The absence of fear combined with the presence of genuine interest produced something we did not have a model for. We do now, I added, because I felt it needed to be said directly. We also owe the cub a significant debt. We isolated it under conditions that were, in retrospect, insufficient for its social development. The humans identified that within hours. We had not identified it in 14 months of pre-deployment observation. The room was quiet after that. Fenrath was not returned to Grevash IV. That had been the original plan, a controlled reintroduction after the study concluded. But Rudo's ongoing assessment of the cub's developmental trajectory indicated that an animal which had formed primary social bonds with non-Thovrak beings, during a critical developmental window, would face significant challenges integrating into a wild Thovrak community. The reintroduction plan was suspended pending further research. Pending further research, Fenrath remained in the habitat. And pending further research, Rudo, Petra, and Suki were granted continued access for what the official documentation described as ongoing cross-species social development observation. What the official documentation did not capture, because official documentation rarely captures the things that actually matter, was the morning 3 weeks after the formal study ended when I came into the observation gallery early, before the rest of the team, and found the monitoring feed showing Fenrath asleep in the central clearing with Suki's cot pulled up alongside, Suki herself asleep with one hand resting on the cub's shoulder plate, and Rudo sitting awake nearby making notes, and Petra doing her morning balance routine in the eastern corner while Fenrath's tail, even in sleep, traced slow arcs across the grass in the direction of the movement. I stood there for a while, just watching it. Then I wrote in my personal log, we released a predator to test humans. The test result was not what we designed it to measure. The test result was this. When the rest of the galaxy looks at a creature and sees danger, humans look at the same creature and ask, quietly, with open hands, what it needs. I closed my log. I went and got my morning supplement, and somewhere in the habitat below, Fenrath woke up, stretched all 6 limbs in the full morning extension sequence, looked at the 3 sleeping and waking humans around it, and made the long, rolling, low vocalization, the contentment one. We had that one documented perfectly by
Would
now.
you have stayed calm or run? Let me know. Will you like
Witness
and
this.
subscribe
This
for more? And
is why
I will
God
see
gave
you in
humans
the
such
next
an
one.
unbreakable will. No force in the galaxy can hold us back. God brought you here for a reason. If you believe in the power of the human spirit, hit subscribe. Join the golden age. See you among the stars.